Hi, welcome back to the Udemy class titled A Clear Logical Argument Guaranteed. So, in this lecture, actually lecture number 22, we're going to discuss some of the inadequacies with the typical type of argument diagramming that you may come across. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the tree-like structure argument diagramming that's most commonly used. Now you'll see this in different argument visualization software programs such as Rationale and iLogos and Arikaria, and they all follow pretty much the same pattern, which is the boxes and the arrows that connect individual premises in support of a conclusion. And here, of course, you can see the string of premises that are involved to reach the conclusion right here. But this is software, but actually this type of tree-like structure has been around a long time. Here's a picture from Richard Whiteley's book, An English Logician, back in 1836, in his book Elements of Logic, and where you can see this same argument represented with the same type of pyramid or tree-like structure. So it's been around a long time. And don't get me wrong, argument visualization has a lot of great benefits in understanding an argument. Certainly, and here's a site, and here's a link to what was originally a speech. Tim Van Gelder and Dr. Monk, great originators of many crucial aspects of argument mapping. But the extent of the benefits of any particular argument visualization depends on the rigor and the robustness of the inferential principles that underpin the visual language. So the typical kinds of inferential structure that is applied in this tree-like structure has a number of fundamental problems. And probably the first one is that it can obscure the order in which one premise depends on another premise in the logical chain of inference. So let me give you an example. So looking at this argument map right here from Whiteley, we're looking at two premises. One is y is x, the other is z is a. And you can't really tell, which comes first in the line of the inference chain. And as we'll discuss later, knowing that really makes a difference. So we've got those two right here. Y is x, z is a. In the same argument map, here's just an example of two more. You have the premise y is b and c is x. And here again, it's not clear which one is first in the inferential line of reasoning. If you dig into it, though, you can unravel this inferential net. You can, by tracking the movement from the z to the x. And here we have a z. And you can track it there we go. Z to A. The A goes to the Y. The Y goes to the B. B goes to the X, and there's also a branch that takes off the Y to the C, and the C to the X. So it's in there. If you pull apart the pieces, you can find the order. And that's what happens when you use a logic bridge, because it always makes clear the premise order in the inferential line of reasoning. So there's never any question, which comes first. Here you see, let's look here, Y is X or Z is A. Well, you can see that when you run it in a logic bridge format, you can see right here, Z is A is first before the Y is X. And we looked at Y is B premise and Z is X premise. And you can see the Y is B is right here. The C is X is here. So you can tell the C is X is actually in a different line from the Y is B. So this always makes clear the order that the premises follow one another. Well, so why does that premise order matter? Well, there's at least 4 reasons why it's important. The first one is that, if you're using an argument map, you're wanting to understand, evaluate, the strength of the argument. And so you want to be able to follow, they say follow the money if you want to understand certain things. Well, with arguments, you want to be able to follow the inference. You want to follow the path of certainty and uncertainty that travels through the line of reasoning so that you can assess how much certainty ends up at the end. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt, by a preponderance of evidence, depending on what the standard is. But if you don't know the logical hierarchy, you can't determine, how the probative force is affected as it moves through the line of reasoning. So here we have the judge, we can call judge of the audience. They always start off right here with the Z, as we've talked, with 100%. But the amount of certainty that this first premise can hold, remember, it's a subjective judgment by each individual as they travel the line of reasoning. So hypothetically, I've said, okay, we're down to 90% because this couldn't hold. The judge didn't perceive, with absolute certainty the truth of this premise. So now we're down to 90. And now the judge looks at the second premise. Well, fortunately, apparently this one must be 100% in the judge's mind because we didn't lose any more. So we still got the same 90. And now we're branching off into 2 parallel lines of reasoning, as you can see here. And of course, these are the premises. This is the Z is A, and here we have one who is A is Y, etc. Okay, so now we're down to 90% level of uncertainty. And here, just hypothetically, I've moved it so we're down to 70% by the time we reach this place in the line of reasoning, and in the other parallel branch, we're down to 20%. But we still got one more premise to go. And of course, how much it can support that 70% or the 20%, how believable on a subjective level it is to the judge, these final premises, determines how much inferential weight at the end we have. And in this case, we've got 50% and 10%. Well, you can't do this kind of analysis in following the path of certainty, the inferential line. You can't track how it changes through each premise if you don't know the order in which, the premises connect to each other. Well, problem number 2 with this obscure order of premise placement. And when you look at a typical tree-like structure, another problem is it doesn't always make it readily apparent the precise number of inference steps that are involved. And this can be really important when your audience is trying to determine how much piling of inference upon inference is happening. So with the Elbe Bridge, you can see every time you have a connection, which we've discussed, you can see 1, 2, 3 inference steps here, 1, 2, 3 inference steps here. Here's a quote from a case that talks about the importance of this. At some point along a rational continuum, inferences may become so attenuated from underlying evidence as to cast doubt on the trier of fact's ultimate conclusion. In other words, the chance of error or speculation increases in proportion to the width of the gap between underlying fact and ultimate conclusion, where the gap is bridged by a succession of inferences, each based upon the preceding one. So the gap they're talking about is right here. And so the court here is saying, the more inferences, 1, 2, 3, the more you have, the more uncertain the acceptance should be of the conclusion. For example, here's a really well-known case that discusses this. And here you had U.S. Supreme Court Justice Rehnquist stated that to uphold the government's contentions here, we have to pile inference upon inference in a manner that would bid fair to convert congressional authority under the Commerce Clause to a general police power of the sort retained by the states. So here, portions of the dissent that he's referring to is the height of this pile put into a logic bridge template. And we'll just run quickly through it. So this was the number of, and of course we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 inference steps here. And here the court was saying, well, the GunFree School Zone Act forbids knowingly possessing a firearm knowingly in a school zone. And he's such that, and remember we repeat the predicate phrase of the last part, but we can look at this as just stepping stones to make it simpler for explanation here, will reduce the number of firearms carried to school by students. So we'll reduce the amount of gun-related violence in schools. So we'll reduce the number of dropouts and victims of gun-related violence who typically have suffered academically. So we'll improve the quality of education in schools. So we'll improve the functional and technological literacy of students. So we'll improve the functional and technological literacy of workers. So we'll improve the business competitiveness of employers in interstate and foreign commerce. So falls within the scope of the Commerce Clause. So you can see being able to see the order of the premises, which isn't readily apparent with the tree-like structure, is really important, and to see how many steps there are, so that the audience and yourself can decide how much piling inference upon inference is going on. And here you can see how high this inference upon inference pile gets. Okay, so number 3. So we're talking about some of the problems that happen with the obscure order of premise placement that happens with the typical tree-like argument mapping that's done. So number 3, if a premise is judged as false, it would not be apparent which of the remaining premises that comprise the argument tree depend on that false premise. This determination is important since any such logical dependency would require that those dependent premises be pruned from the argument tree as well. So you look here and you're not sure really what's hanging off this that relies on this. It's not obvious. But if you do a logic bridge, you can see right away, well, the Z is A right here. So that tells you if you don't get past this first premise, everything else down beneath it, can't be reached. So the inference, the movement of certainty stops right here. So without knowing where to, the impact of a false statement and how that should cause you to prune the tree is a serious problem with this design. Another one of the problems is it makes determinations of conditional relevancy very difficult. Remember, or if this is the first time, conditional relevancy is a determination by the court that an item of evidence will be provisionally accepted into evidence pending the latter submission of evidence that provides the link from that original evidence to the main conclusion, such as the defendant is guilty. So you notice the court, for example, is saying, okay, I'll allow for now evidence of A as Y. Conditionally, we'll say it's conditionally relevant. But then the court or the audience, is waiting for you to provide the link from this evidence to the main conclusion. But with this obscure order, you don't really know precisely what the links are between here. But it's always obvious with the logic bridge because here's the link, and this tells you, these additional premises for this line of reasoning would have to be introduced, and for this line of reasoning, these two premises would have to be introduced. So, when you're dealing with issues of conditional relevancy, knowing what's between you, what's between the evidence that you've offered and what are the premises that link it to the end of the line of reasoning is really important, and it's just not obvious with the typical tree-like structure. One of the nice things about the logic bridge is that you always have a start of a line of reasoning and you always have a finish. So when you have a start and a finish, and then you insert the premises with them constrained by the formality that we've talked about before, so that they fit properly. I'm not talking about formal reasoning. Remember, all the reasoning in the logic bridge, relies on defeasible class inclusion transitivity, and that can work for any argument. But here, without a clear start and finish, you don't really know. For example, here, Y is B. Well, you're claiming it's relevant because you've popped it in underneath and said, well, here, I'm going to stick it right here. But that's just kind of a deeming. It's just it's an assertion, but nothing's really obvious, certainly not obviously quickly, that this legitimately connects to the conclusion. While in the logic bridge, it's always obvious because since the structure of each premise is regimented in a way that always links one to the next, there's never a question of relevancy as long as it falls within the line, or as an assumption, which we can talk about later. And remember, there's a difference between, as we've talked about, inferentially linked premises and supporting assumptions for each of those premises, whether they're necessary or ancillary. probably in my mind, one of the biggest fundamental challenges or problems with this typical tree-like structure is it usually comes with an open architecture. While this allows the argument map to accommodate different argument forms, this feature also permits any premises to be inserted in the box regardless of whether an actual logical relationship exists. So if these are blank, and it doesn't really help the student in deciding exactly what should be put in these blanks. And for the audience, there's no assurance whatsoever that actually this logical relationship exists. You just stuck them in two boxes and put a link, an arrow, and trust me. So I think one of the biggest problems is structural fallacies are thus welcome. There's an inadequate rigor and a formality to rely on the assertions being made. Now, admittedly, as you see here, there are rough heuristics that are sometimes suggested when using this open architecture. Two of the well-known ones are the rabbit rule and the holding hands rule, which I'm not going to go into detail right now. Very worth reading. Here's a site that you can go to look about them. But these semi-formal structures are still really insufficient. This rabbit rule and holding hands has a number of problems. Just a few of them, for example, are that these two heuristics rely upon an incomplete model of inference. So many structural errors can be missed. So it may begin to point you perhaps in the right direction, but it's just too loose in its formality to provide any assurance. Another big problem with these heuristics, these two in particular, is they don't differentiate between inferentially linked premises and supporting assumptions. Here, of course, you can see these are the inferentially linked premises, and these are the supporting assumptions that connect to, and of course it's not obvious in this tree-like mode, but they connect to one of these premises here. Of course, we'll see later these support actually this single premise. Now, the rabbit rule and the holding hands tell you to look for significant terms, but that's kind of subjective whether something is significant or not. And then the question is it a single word or is it a phrase? That's really hard to tell. And this whole idea of significant terms, the rabbit rule doesn't make clear. That only applies to inferential premises. It doesn't apply to supporting assumptions. So unless your design makes that distinction, if you start trying to apply the rabbit or holding hands rule to other premises that can be appropriately within the enclosure, but are not inferentially linked, but assumption linked, you're going to be lost. Now here, if you want to read more about that particular discussion of rabbit rule and holding hands, is a link to a short writing I did. And here's just another example. I was talking about the heuristic, but failing to recognize the difference between inferentially linked premises and supporting assumptions. But in general, the whole tree open architecture design makes no distinction that I've seen between the inferentially linked premises and the supporting assumptions. They're all just tossed under here. Now here you can see from what we've learned in the previous 31 lessons that these two are the inferentially linked premises and these are two supporting assumptions. So with this kind of problems, it is unclear which inferentially linked premise is supported by those supporting assumptions. And then, without knowing that, it really makes it difficult to determine what the probative weight is. Now here we've just used a simple LB template of that same argument. Here you can see the president was born in Hawaii according to the witness. Premise 2, one who was born in Hawaii according to the witness was born in Hawaii. Well, this and just this premise depends upon at least these two, certainly there can be more, these two supporting assumptions, that the witness had the necessary perceptual capabilities to perceive the event, and here the witness had adequate memory capabilities. And so this is just, remember, as we talked about much earlier, you have different kinds of assumption sets. You have ones that address the reliability of a source, and that can be if it's a witness or an expert or an instrument. And we have ones that go with analogy. We have ones that go with sample generalizing. And of course, in a unique individual context, they can arise just for that particular circumstance as well. And they can get, the level of assumptions can get pretty deep. So here, and we've seen this before, but this is kind of the multi-level support where we have our original logic bridge line of reasoning. Here's the audience traveling with their, right now, 10, each one 10%, 100%, seeing how far it can get, whether the probative weight, strength-bearing capacity of each of the parts of the bridge, the premises can hold it. And here you can see graphically that premise 1 is supported by this assumption, which is a result of these two inferentially linked premises. And this first premise is supported by this assumption. And you can see how the lattices of one upon the other can get quite complex. So you better know your difference between inferential premises and supporting assumptions. Now this is, of course, the outline mode of using the logic bridge based on the defeasible class inclusion transitivity, DKIT. And this is a good way when you start getting really a dense argument with a lot of assumptions. Here you can see, and of course it's just the indents that make the differences. So here you have, for example, number 1 is your main conclusion. Barack is a natural-born citizen of the United States. Main conclusion. And here you have 1, 2, 3 premises, inferentially linked premises that bring this conclusion. All the 1-1s right here, those 3. But when you look at this second premise, you can see that it's supported by certain assumptions here, 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 which itself, this assumption is created or found through inferentially linked premises, which some of them can have assumptions. So you can see this is how the layer can get so deep in terms of premises supported by assumptions, supported by inferentially linked premises, some of which are supported by assumptions, how deep it can go. So here you have, for example, the premise, the coworker saw the notes as they were written, which is part of showing that the coworker had firsthand knowledge of the notes, which is an assumption that supports the premise the nurse on duty remembered the incident correctly, which is an assumption and you can see how the the multiple layers and the relationships between inferentially linked premises and assumptions should be properly structured. Now here we show just kind of a reminder of the scaffolding and the rigor that you get with, I've used Greeking here to show you that as long as you follow the constraints that we've discussed in any argument that's logical, whether it's deductive, abductive, inductive, plausible of whatever nature can fit within the structure, the requirements of the structure ensure that you've put together, a logical argument. So that's the beauty of it, is that it's universal. Any premise can work in it. It's precise, it's rigorous, and it's kind of fail-safe. You can never end up with some structural fallacy. So another problem, getting back to the tree-like structure, is that typically when it has an objection, it might put dotted lines around or change the color or point an arrow and say, okay, here's an objection to this premise. But just simply attaching a box with a red line as an objection in the tree-like structure fails to make apparent the degree of impact on the final determination of certainty, for the whole argument. You don't remember follow the money? Well, you've got to be able to follow the inferences, which means you've got to be able to follow from start to finish how the level of certainty changes. So here, just an example, another format of the logic bridge, we have the stepping stone format, and here you can see 1, 2, the 3 premises. The president has a Hawaiian birth certificate according to the witness. The blue, any such that has a Hawaiian birth certificate according to the witness has a Hawaiian birth certificate, and any such that has a Hawaiian birth certificate is a natural-born U.S. citizen. Here you can see how the objection actually happens. Here, remember, there's 3 kinds of objections we've got. We've got the opposing, the diverting, and the obstructing, which we've talked about in previously. Here you see a diverting objection, which is you've got this level of certainty just coming along fine, passing through here. But here it diverts some of that level of certainty, so it splits off. Actually, this right here should show the 100. It should show 100, so you can see it breaking into the 40 and the 60. Because you have this premise says, any such that has a Hawaiian birth certificate is a natural-born citizen. But from the opposing party, they say, no, any such that has a Hawaiian birth certificate, which is here, can lead you to this, which predicate, which is might have had parents who were legal residents of Hawaii who applied under the born out-of-state exception under section 338-17.8. So from what is here, the subject of that premise, it can lead to different paths. One person's arguing it leads right here, but that level of certainty through the diverting objection can be diverted off the path, which weakens. It can weaken, depending on how much is diverted, the ultimate level of certainty that reaches the finish in the inferential line. And you just don't, just popping an objection down there and pointing at a premise doesn't help you follow the level of certainty as it moves through the inferential structure that you need to be able to do if you want to make in the real world, if you want to make an assessment of how much reliance should be given to that argument. these are just a few examples I wanted to show you. Remember I said that the logic bridge always has a start and a finish. And remember, the start is always the subject phrase of the main conclusion, and the finish is always the predicate phase of the main conclusion. And, you can look at these later. This is from Professor Engelbretson's wonderful book, Line Drawings for Logic. And this is an argument diagram, the way he came up with, of how different premises and conclusions, how they might look. And I've simply translated them into, the categorical version for a defeasible class inclusion transitivity structure. Here you can see this represents not a Venn diagram now. So you have, in this area, you have every A, and within this larger one is every B, and within the larger square, this category is C. So in this case, you don't need the defeasible here, just through class inclusion transitivity. Since this one's inside this square and this square is inside this bigger one, then through transitivity, every A is C. So I won't go into such detail on all of them. Here's another one. Every A is B, some C is A, some C is B. Still comes up with the same start and finish as the conclusion, which is the point I'm trying to make here. The start of your first premise right here becomes and the predicate phrase of your last premise is your conclusion, no matter how many intervening premises that you have. And here's another argument, the premises and the conclusion. This is Professor's argument map that represents that. And here again we have some logic bridge examples, different formats to show how the start and the finish still can be extracted, no matter how complicated it looks. And it's always that the subject of the first premise and the subject phrase of the last premise forms the main conclusion. Here's a minor relational term used here in this one. Still same pattern of start and finish. Here's a major relational term. Right here still translates into, I want to go back one. Yeah, I just wanted to point it here. In this case, still same start and finish, but this is where the importance of being able to recognize and account for supporting assumptions becomes clear. So for example, in this, you have two premises here, but this last premise, when structured in a clear logic bridge fashion, this premise depends on this assumption that every A is B. So you have to, you're always accounting, remember, for both the inferentially linked and the supporting assumptions. And here the supporting assumption is indicated here by that vertical black line that's up, holding up the is R to some A. Just wanted to go back and show you that sometimes the assumptions kick in. So this is kind of a summary. I'm not going to read them all again here, of some of the problems with the typical tree-like argument mapping that kind of fall under at least three categories. Here we've got the obscurity of premise order, the obscurity of a clear start and finish, and a lack of sufficient logical relationship formality. And these are some of the points we've discussed underneath that. Now, you can find more about this as we've discussed. These are 2 Oxford Journal articles that I've written on these issues, and a few works by Professor Engelbretson and one by Professor Summers and Professors Engelbretson, Summers and Engelbretson, and their work on the new syllogistic, not the old syllogistic, but the new syllogistic, is kind of the foundation for the and their conclusions and findings that any statement can be put into a categorical form is the foundation for the work upon which I've extended, and of course relied on many people along the way. Thank you, and see you in the next lecture.